This time on combat ships. Vessels armed to the teeth, ready for battle.
These are incredibly bristling with power ships.
What they couldn't outgun, they could outrun.
From the lone wolf cruiser fighting on the high seas,
controlling the sea lanes, dealing with pirates,
to the destroyer that stared down the largest kamikaze attack in history.
6 airplanes loaded with bombs, smashing into a 2,000-ton warship. They never should have survived, but they did.
Today, armed with the latest weapons.
So it's a fully autonomous weapon system, completely self-reliant, and absolutely lethal.
They are the backbone of modern navies. Combat ships. Fast. Effective.
the mission is pure James Bond espionage.
Deadly.
Japan is willing to throw the dice to engage just about every aspect of their military force in a climactic, decisive battle to stop the United States.
They have changed the world.
Warships have been key factors in global history, from the beginning of civilization to the present day.
Thanks to clever design, raw firepower, and the heroism of their crews. Destroyers and cruisers are the quintessential combat ships.
There were no other types of ships that saw as much action as destroyers and cruisers.
Each has its own role within a navy. A destroyer's name comes from its original purpose, a torpedo boat destroyer. But by World War II, their role had expanded.
They built hundreds and hundreds of destroyers during World War II. And the reason why was they were so good at so many different jobs. They were big enough to have an impact, they were small enough not to be too expensive.
They had speed and endurance to move with a battle fleet and enough firepower to protect it against any enemy.
You could arm a destroyer against aircraft, you could arm it against submarines, you could arm it against surface ships, and you could put mines on it. You could do all these things in the same mission. What other ships could do that?
But to keep them fast and agile, they had little protection.
Destroyers were sunk in large numbers by all sides. They're expendable. I mean, everybody lost a lot of destroyers.
But one American destroyer fought some of the fiercest action in naval history and survived. The USS Laffy. Laffy was commissioned in 1944. Her skipper was 36-year-old Commander Julian Becton.
Captain Becton was quite a man. The crew loved him. He could be real strict on some of the discipline, but the men knew if someone was penalized for anything, they deserved it.
Becton was a man with a code. He worked his crew hard, insisting on endless drills and training.
They tired of that when they were moving across the Pacific to Hawaii. Why are we having all these drills? Well, they found out when they were off Okinawa.
On April 1st, 1945, the U.S. launched the invasion of Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific. For the Allies, it was the final hurdle before a planned attack on Japan's home islands. For the Japanese, it was a last stand to protect their motherland. USS Laffy was part of a massive 1,200-ship fleet surrounding the island. By now, her crew was battle-hardened. They had fought the Japanese from the Philippines to Iwo Jima and witnessed their devastating new tactic.
In
the last few months of the Second World War, the Japanese knew they were losing, and thus they came up with this idea of the kamikaze, the suicide pilots, turning the aircraft into bombs and simply crashing straight onto American warships. They achieved devastating results.
There's letters of kamikaze pilots that have survived, and they were not particularly happy about going out and dying for their country, but that's what they had to do, and so they did it.
In a final letter to his parents, one pilot wrote,
I am seized with an impulse to cry, but with an effort, I hold them back and will go resolutely.
Aircraft carriers were the kamikaze's ideal target, so the American fleet was organized to protect them at all costs.
The way the US Navy operated in late 44, 45 was that you'd have the fleet and the carrier groups here, and then you'd have outside them so-called radar pickets, destroyers, equipped with radar, whose job was to pick up attacking enemy either warships or, much more likely, planes.
It was a dangerous assignment for the destroyers, with enemy aircraft flying in from Japan's home island, only 340 miles north of Okinawa.
The first American ships they were likely to see were these picket destroyers, and so the picket destroyers took a terrible pounding from the kamikazes, and a destroyer is a small ship not designed to stand punishment.
The United States lost 120 destroyer types in World War II. We lost 42 to kamikazes, so kamikazes were the single largest cause of loss.
2 weeks after the invasion began, on the 13th of April, Commander Becton received an ominous order. Laffy was assigned to Radar Picket 1.
Of all 16 picket stations, number 1 was the one they most dreaded, because picket station number 1 was closer to the Japanese home islands.
News of the assignment spread through the ship. Lieutenant Frank Manson, an officer aboard Laffy, knew the danger.
None of the 5 destroyers sent to Radar Picket 1 since April the 1st had survived. All had been sunk or so badly damaged that they could not be used in combat.
On the 14th of April, Laffy took her position at Picket Station 1.
Well, she was probably in one of the most dangerous spots of water on the planet at that time.
The crew waited anxiously for 2 days. Then on the morning of the 16th of April, all hell broke loose.
At 8:27, suddenly the radar plot showed all kinds of dots, each dot representing an incoming Japanese aircraft. 165 kamikazes approached that day. 22 peeled off and targeted Laffy.
As the crew rushed to their stations, Becton turned his ship's starboard side to the attack, bringing all his guns to bear. Laffy's main 5-inch guns opened up on the attackers.
Here were the big cannon, and there were 3 twin mounts. Those guns could fire shells to a range of 9 miles.
With a good crew, each barrel could fire between 15 and 18 rounds a minute. And on 16 April 1945, they were firing them as fast as they could load them.
When aircraft got closer to Laffy, then the 40 millimeter and 20 millimeter guns take over. If you had to use your 40 and 20 millimeter, it means kamikazes getting awful close.
Incoming aircraft traveled a mile every 15 seconds, making them hard to hit.
You had to stand there as that plane came straight toward you and not budge and fire away and just hope for the best. If you didn't get it, it got you.
Laffy's gunners stood their ground, downing the first 8 planes.
Nobody was injured. Nobody was killed. The men were feeling a little bit better.
Becton's tactics worked. Maneuvering Laffy so the side of the ship faced the incoming kamikaze made it a narrower target and gave him enough firepower to repel the attacks.
Now the catch is, If there's an aircraft coming in here and another one here, what do? You know, sooner or later there was going to be a coordinated attack that was going to hit Laffey.
The 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th planes came in quick succession. Attacking from different sides, they overwhelmed Laffey's defenses. Off the island of Okinawa, the destroyer USS Laffy had been hit by 3 kamikazes and 1 bomb in 3 minutes.
These planes hit and just smashed into the deck, dropped bombs, went cartwheeling across, igniting fires, spewing gasoline all over, shrapnel puncturing holes in the superstructured deck.
Just 1 direct kamikaze hit could sink a ship. Destroyers weren't built to survive this much punishment.
The whole aft section of the ship was dealing with smoke and fire. It was chaos back here.
Captain Becton's insistence on drills and training now paid off. Damage control crews began dousing the fires. Sailors instinctively moved explosives away from the flames.
Becton's drills were designed precisely for that. He wanted to drill his men so thoroughly that they reacted, instead of thinking first and then acting. If you thought first before you acted in combat, you died.
The crew kept Laffy afloat, but the last attack had damaged her rudder. Locking it at 26 degrees, she could now only go in circles.
Now, a ship's main defense, besides its guns, was the ability to maneuver. That's gone now.
4 more kamikazes approached from the port side, where half of Laffy's guns were already wiped out. 2 ripped into her already damaged aft section. Luckily, the front guns were still intact, and the gunners dispatched the next 3 aircraft, numbers 17, 18, and 19. But Laffy's stern was beginning to dip beneath the waves.
After the 19th kamikaze came in, Lieutenant Manson walked over to Becton and he just said, you know, Captain, you think maybe we should abandon ship? Captain Becton gave a quote that I think ranks up there with any quote in naval history. He said, "I'll never surrender as long as a gun can fire. I'm going to keep fighting to the last gun."
Becton later recalled,
"The ship might sink under us. We might not be able to sail her. But I wasn't going to abandon her."
3 more aircraft took aim at Laffy. 2 hit the ship with bombs. 1 more hit, and the Laffy was almost certainly done for. But as the Japanese planes swung around for the kill, American Corsair fighters shot them out of the sky. Help had finally arrived.
Suddenly, silence. And the men said it was a deafening silence, if you can understand that oxymoron. But to them, they had heard all this noise of battle for 80 minutes. And suddenly, silence.
With American fighters now circling overhead, Laffy was safe from Japanese attacks. But she was barely afloat.
The last third almost looked like a giant had come and just sort of crushed it in its fists, just sort of twisted it around. The gun positions and the aft part of the ship were gone. The 2 barrels of that 5-inch mount were twisted at opposite ends. Below decks, there was significant damage near the magazines, the ammunition magazines, but the fires never reached it. And Becton attributed that to the supreme effort of the damage control parties in fighting the fires.
But survival came at a high price. 32 men died and 71 were wounded, almost a third of her crew. Only just afloat, Laffy made it back to Okinawa for initial repairs.
She's given credit for shooting down 9 aircraft, which is kind of incredible. But she was still hit by 6. And she was hit by 4 bombs as well. They never should have survived.
Against unbelievable odds, she endured, was repaired, and would remain in service until 1975.
I always love stories about courage against incredible odds. When you think of 22 individuals purposely wanting to sink you with their planes. And you stand up to that, and you surmount that. That's a great story. It's a saga for the ages.
In World War II, destroyers were small, cheap, versatile combat ships. But when a bigger punch was required, navies turned to their cruisers. These were larger, with more powerful guns. Cruisers began as lone wolves, built to patrol the world's oceans on their own.
Cruiser effectively describes the role that a number of naval ships had, and it was based around an independent command. They were ships that were designed to be on their own.
And a ship that you could afford to lose, but a ship that's powerful enough where it can support itself in a bad situation.
One of the most famous was the British sloop HMS Gannet.
Gannet represents the type of small cruiser which was vital for the policing of the British Empire. Their main role was cruising around the seas of the world, protecting trade and interdicting the enemy's trade.
In the 19th century, showing up was often all it took to persuade weaker powers to fall in line.
A small gun and a British flag are usually enough to get regional players to behave themselves. The Royal Navy is too important to mess around with.
The cruiser's intimidating tactics became known as gunboat diplomacy. Ships like Gannet, although relatively small with a crew of just 140, were heavily armed.
She had 3 64-pounder guns. She had 2 7-inch muzzle loads on the main deck that could move to either side. She had 2 5-inch breech-loading guns on the poop deck at the stern, so really quite a punch.
And when mere threats were not enough, these guns were put to use. In 1881, a revolt began in Northeast Africa. Rebels fought to push British and Egyptian forces out of Sudan.
That revolt sweeps across the country and finally ends up at what effectively is the last British-Egyptian toehold in Sudan at the port of Suakin.
HMS Gannet was sent to support the beleaguered port.
The range of Gannet's guns were much bigger than the range of anything that the Mahdiist rebels had got. Gannet effectively sat in the harbour and used her after-armament, the 5-inch breech-loading guns, to shell the Mahdiist forces that had surrounded and were investing Suakin, to the extent that Suakin didn't fall. It allowed that toehold that then eventually turned into the recapture of Sudan for Egypt and Britain.
Together, Britain and Egypt would control Sudan for another 60 years. As cruisers like Gannet policed the oceans for Britain, they found themselves on the front line in the fight against the slave trade. Britain had once traded slaves heavily, but outlawed it in 1807 after intense public pressure.
You have the establishment of the West Africa Squadron, which consists of a number of Royal Naval vessels which are tasked with patrolling the west coast of Africa and intercepting slaving vessels of other countries, as well as the odd British interloper.
The anti-slavery patrol was one of the most fraught, difficult tasks the Royal Navy had to face. On the West African coast, they had to patrol 3,000 miles of very impenetrable coastline where slavers were making huge fortunes.
While unable to completely stop this well-funded, gruesome industry, the Royal Navy did have some success.
The most obvious positive outcome from the activities of the West Africa Squadron is the saving of 150,000 African lives, which otherwise would have been obliged to survive the journey across the Atlantic and into enforced servitude.
The brutal Atlantic slave trade only stopped when slavery was abolished in the Americas in the 1860s. But the trading of humans in Africa was not yet over.
Britain's anti-slavery efforts do shift from the Atlantic world into the Indian Ocean. Along the east coast of Africa, particularly in Zanzibar and in Mombasa, you had a number of sultanates which, as a central point of their economy, were supplying huge numbers of enslaved Africans to markets in Egypt, in Sudan, in Oman, and elsewhere in what we now describe as the Middle East.
HMS Gannet was sent to stop it. She made regular anti-slavery patrols in the Red Sea. In 1887, Gannet's crew spotted a suspicious ship.
They stopped an Arab dhow, which was a small Arab trading ship. And in that particular case, the Arab dhow indicated that it probably was doing something that they didn't like by opening fire on the crew.
A journalist based in Suakin reported on the incident.
While chasing a supposed slave dhow near Mersa Halib, the boat's crew was suddenly attacked by a large party of natives concealed in a creek. Lieutenant Stewart was fatally wounded and died on board.
The slavers likely sunk their own ship and fled. Undeterred, HMS Gannet continued her patrols until the slave trade ended around 1900. She survives as a powerful symbol of the Victorian anti-slavery campaign. In 2009, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown gave President Obama a gift of a pen holder made from a piece of timber from the Gannet. The old cruiser's battles are not forgotten. But time and new technology made ships like Gannet obsolete. The cruisers of the 20th century would look very different. By the Second World War, cruisers were huge, powerful ships. With thick armor and large guns, they were built to take on any enemy.
They'd evolved into ships that were incredibly strong. Different ranges of sizes, but they could take a lot of punishment, they could deliver a lot of punishment.
These mighty combat ships were given new roles.
The British built cruisers to protect shipping from warships. The Americans built cruisers to fight other warships in fleet actions. And all the world's navies tended to fall into one or other of those two camps.
In either case, they were now heavily armed, enough to do serious damage. 5:23 a.m., D-Day, June 6, 1944. Off the Normandy beaches, an armada of Allied warships begin a massive bombardment. Over 500 guns were trained on the German positions.
The soldiers coming ashore, although they were deafened by the gunfire sometimes, felt much more confident as they saw the shells landing ashore among the Germans. And German morale slumped as these very heavy shells began to come in and cause huge amounts of destruction. It made counterattacking and getting rid of the Allies off the beaches impossible.
The Royal Navy cruiser HMS Belfast played a key role in the Allied assault. Her guns fired one of the first salvos on D-Day. They didn't stop for 2 hours. One soldier at D-Day wrote about Belfast.
The cruiser sat like a broody hen, surrounded by drifters and landing craft. As we passed, her guns spoke from time to time.
The operation of Belfast's guns was a team effort. In all, over 220 members of the crew were involved in sending her deadly 6-inch shells to the target. The process began here, with the gun director, high above the 6-inch guns.
The crew will jump in there when action stations go, and the director will train round left or right to where the target is. There would be about 8 or 9 men in there, and their object is to continually be on the target.
The gun director crew fed the target's range and bearing to a nerve center in the heart of the ship. This is a mechanical computer known as an Admiralty Fire Control Table. It calculated the angles of train, left or right, and elevation, up or down, for the 6-inch guns.
This was state-of-the-art when it was put in 1938, and it's an analog computer. And an analog computer is designed just to solve one problem. You can't reprogram it. This is designed solely to compute where we need to point the guns to have the best chance of hitting the ship.
The crew fed the computer information about the enemy position from the gun director to help make its calculations.
For a start, we have our own ship, which is in this dial here, and this tells us where we are. And then from the director, we get the enemy ship's angle to us, and also its speed it's going and the range it is from us. And that is all fed in there. But also, we get barometric pressure, wind speed, and drift, and everything like that, because all of these add on to affect the shell when the shell leaves the barrel.
Once the computer has all the data it needs, it sends out the information to the ship's 6-inch gun turrets. Belfast has 4 turrets, each weighing over 190 tons.
There's 2 bits of information. The training angle for the turret, which comes into the small compartment over on the left-hand side of this gun turret, and also to each of the 3 elevating positions to get the correct elevation for the guns.
This is the elevation dial in B turret.
For the operator here, it's simply a case of lining up the actual position with the gun to the position that is required to fire it. There's a lever here and a clutch. Up for up, down for down, and for fine, control the hand wheel. Just for that last little correction to line up the actual position of the gun with the indicator position coming from the transmitting station.
Each gun was supplied by a shell room deep in the bowels of the ship, protected by 3 inches of deck armor. This is A turret's shell room.
The carousel is independently driven. It revolves very slowly, so that the guys who are loading the shells into these hoists have always got a shell to grab. The rest of the crew in here are taking shells out of these bins around the shell room, fusing the shells themselves and loading them onto the carousel, and then they're manhandled onto these hydraulic hoists and they go straight up into the turret itself.
Each type of 112-pound shell is painted a distinctive color so it can be recognized in the heat of battle. They are lethal projectiles.
They're semi-armor piercing, so the idea is they go into the target a small amount before exploding. The fuses are kept separate in boxes around here, and they literally just screw into the top of the shells themselves.
The men who work down here knew that if a fire broke out, they were expendable.
Extinguishers may be used for very small fires in here, and a last resort is to actually flood the whole area. Hopefully they get out, but the priority is to save the ship, not individuals.
The shells were sent up to a well-drilled crew of 7, capable of firing 8 rounds a minute.
The breech is opened. There's a shell come down this loading tray. That comes up the hoist from the shell room, slides down the loading tray onto here. That is then brought in front of the gun and hand rammed right up into the barrel itself.
The gunner then rammed the cordite charge that propels the shell into the breech.
The tray's moved out of the way. Breech is closed. A vent tube goes in there, little brass cartridge full of priming powder. Breech is closed, and then the gun's elevated up to its correct angle, ready for firing.
The gunners themselves didn't feel the full force of the guns. John Harrison was responsible for the smooth running of Belfast's forward weapons.
Inside a turret, there's so much noise going on that you don't hear the gun fire. You might feel a bit of concussion as the gun recoils, because it's got to move air. That's the only thing, a dull thud and just a little compression of air.
But the rest of Belfast's crew was well aware of the gun's power.
I'm 87 years old now, and I can still feel the noise of those guns. Everything would go flying around. If you was in your hammock trying to get some sleep after a watch during the night, the blast from the 6-inch guns was to lift you up out your hammock and drop you down again. And that is mighty, mighty scary, I can tell you.
On D-Day, Belfast's guns were blazing.
Being on the receiving end of naval gunfire of any size tends to be very unpleasant and rather terminal. HMS Belfast was firing 6-inch shells. They would come in at about the speed of sound in a ballistic arc, and often the first indication you would have that you were under fire was the explosions all around you.
Belfast and other surface warships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, played an absolutely key role in shooting the British and American forces and Canadian forces in as far as the beaches were concerned. Naval fire support was actually more accurate than aerial bombing, and it played an absolutely key role in getting the troops ashore and also protecting the Allied forces from German counterattacks.
The crew on Belfast would witness the success of D-Day, but the war was far from over. More sea battles would have to be fought and won, and new combat ships were needed. During World War II, there were two main types of cruisers: light, like HMS Belfast, and heavy.
The custom grew in the 1930s of calling 8-inch gun-armed cruisers heavy cruisers to differentiate them from light cruisers with 6-inch guns or smaller guns. And the largest of the heavy cruisers were Des Moines, Newport News, and Salem. Spectacular, powerful, beautiful ships.
Of the 3 Des Moines-class cruisers, only one survives: the USS Salem. Today, this incredible ship is kept alive in Quincy, Massachusetts, by a team of dedicated veterans.
When they were built, they were state-of-the-art. What they couldn't outgun, they could outrun. The ship was fast. I mean, it could go circles around a battleship.
This ship could probably do about 34 to 35 knots. 35 knots is about 38, 39 miles an hour. That's very fast, very fast.
Speed was not her only asset. Salem's main armaments were 9 Mark 16 8-inch guns set in 3 triple mounts.
The big thing was the guns were automatic.
Much like on HMS Belfast, sailors loaded hoists with shells and powder cases. These would be transported up to the guns, but from here on in, everything else was automatic. Hydraulic cradles lifted the powder case and shell into transfer bays, which set the 2 elements in alignment behind the breech. A rammer pushed the round into the chamber and the breech closed. Target acquired. After the recoil, the empty powder case was expelled just as a new round was put in place. This could happen non-stop every 6 seconds.
They could keep on firing and firing and firing. They'd stay on target with the radar. Whereas the other ships, they had to come down, reload, clean out, go back on target, find the target.
Salem's 8-inch guns could fire 3 times faster than any previous gun that size. With all 9 firing, Salem could send a barrage of 90 rounds, 30,000 pounds of steel every minute, hitting targets nearly 18 miles away.
Once they start firing, you could feel the ship move. When they fired these guns at broadside, you could feel the ship move.
This modern cruiser was fast and powerful, built to take on any other ship of its time. But USS Salem was too late to join the war she was built for.
There were going to be about 8 of them that were going to build this type. The war ended. This was still being built, almost built. There was 3 of them of this type. It was the USS Salem, the USS Newport News, and the USS Des Moines. So they scrapped all the other cruisers that were going to be built because they didn't need them. They kept these 3 because we were all done and put them in service. The only one to see combat was the Newport News. They went to Vietnam.
Though there were no major ship-to-ship battles in Vietnam, the Newport News' powerful guns would prove very effective.
The South Vietnamese army became hugely dependent on support from offshore bombardment. And whenever it got into trouble, obviously the warships offshore were able to provide artillery to support the South Vietnamese 10, 15, 20 miles inland. And they valued this enormously.
So the USS Newport News and all the other heavy cruisers that are being used, this is just massive firepower. They would fire on particular military installations, roads, any targets that they could find.
The most crucial of these targets was Haiphong Harbor in North Vietnam.
In 1972, the North Vietnamese launched something called the Easter Offensive, where they try to attack South Vietnam, similar to the Tet Offensive of 1968. So it's a major military offensive. And President Richard Nixon wants to respond. He absolutely wants to retaliate with this.
Bombarding and mining Haiphong was part of this response. 85% of all North Vietnam's imports, including weapons, came through this harbor. Shutting it down would strain the North's crucial supply lines.
The goal is to bring the North Vietnamese to their knees so that they will negotiate an end to the war. So that's kind of the big strategy behind that particular operation.
The harbor was heavily defended, with multiple shore batteries on the Do Sun Peninsula throwing out 6-inch shells and surface-to-air missiles protecting against aircraft. To overwhelm these defenses, the U.S. Navy assembled a task unit of 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers.
Among them, their heaviest piece in the area, Newport News, with its 9 fully automatic 8-inch guns, capable of delivering an enormous weight of firepower.
The bombardment began at 3:47 a.m. on the 10th of May, 1972. Newport News fired 77 8-inch rounds at its primary target, the Cap Bai airfield, and its ammunitions and fuel stores. As the shore batteries opened up, Newport News and the other ships hurled 5-inch rounds back at them, completely overwhelming the defenders. A sailor from one of the destroyers remembered the action.
When North Vietnamese shore batteries opened up, effective counter-battery fire from the combined cruiser-destroyer force silenced them. In less than 30 minutes, the entire action was over.
They hit their targets, they do the job they're supposed to do, and they're taking a lot of return fire that allows an aircraft to get in and lay those mines.
The sea mines shut down Haiphong Harbor for 300 days. It gave the U.S. some badly needed leverage and helped bring North Vietnam back to the table to negotiate a ceasefire in January 1973. USS Newport News proved her worth 3 decades after she and her sister ships were built. But Vietnam was the heavy cruiser's high watermark.
Heavy cruisers, like a lot of things after Vietnam, start to go by the wayside for a number of different reasons. These cruisers, they're expensive as heck to build. You need a lot of manpower, and there's more and more reliance on the missiles.
USS Salem was the last of her kind. Big guns no longer ruled the seas. The age of guided missiles had arrived. In the mid-1950s, missiles began replacing guns as the main armament on combat ships. Today, this development has allowed the fusion of multiple roles into fewer, more versatile vessel types, like the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers.
They're the most numerous class of American surface warship. They have good general purpose capabilities. They are very effective ships indeed, and they are perhaps the image of the modern US Navy.
There are 67 of these ships in service today, with more planned. One of those 67 is USS Howard.
As a class of ship, it's a guided missile destroyer where we provide air warfare, surface warfare, anti-submarine warfare, strike warfare, and able to provide those across the globe.
Its diverse capabilities have made it a jack of all trades.
The Arleigh Burke destroyer is important to the United States Navy because it's able to operate independently with a carrier strike group or with an amphibious strike group. And because it's able to do all of that, it becomes the backbone of the United States fleet.
Its incredible effectiveness is down to an advanced system, the Aegis. This combat system uses computers and radar to track and guide weapons to destroy enemy targets. A vertical launch system can fire a multitude of missiles against surface craft, anti-ship missiles, aircraft, submarines, land targets, and ballistic missiles. It can even engage all of these simultaneously. A highly trained crew of 30 inside the Combat Information Center, or CIC, manages the Aegis system.
CSC, RC, land deactivated, sectors turned off.
Oh, we still have the auto SM in there.
Yeah.
I wonder if those parameters still meet the requirements of the actual area defense, self-defense.
Aegis is designed to help the crew in the CIC assess the threat and determine which weapon can best deal with it.
It's very smart. It's doing all its calculations simultaneously while our watchdowers are doing their controlling actions, and it's going to calculate when and where it's going to actually execute the intercept of that contact. It will actually select the missile it's going to launch at it to take care of that threat.
Key to the entire operation is state-of-the-art radar.
FCA-2 Cruz is our radar system controller, and he's in charge of the spy radar, the heart and soul of an Aegis destroyer. He's specifically looking out 200 plus nautical miles to truly identify any aircraft, potential threats in the area. So without spy, we can't launch missiles, we can't defend our own ship.
Once the target is verified and the correct countermeasure is chosen, there is a final control before launch.
So FCA-3 Duncan is the missile system supervisor. So he is the last line of defense before we actually launch missiles. He is maintaining the overall inventory and control of those missiles before they leave the vertical launching system. So key player in combat.
As well as missiles, USS Howard has a pair of rotating cannons known as CIWS to defend the ship. These can fire 20mm shells at a rate of 4,500 rounds a minute.
Close-in weapon system is a weapon system that's more of a short range, last line of defense. It's computer controlled, radar guided to deliver rounds downrange. Its primary mission is to engage anti-ship missiles. Secondary mission area would be surface contacts.
Amanda and a dedicated team of technicians must ensure the CIWS is ready at a moment's notice.
So prior to any pre-fire checks that we do, we make sure that all the tension is set properly, that all of these brackets are properly secured. Make sure our hero shield is installed. Ammunition feed belts clipped in properly to the entrance and exit units. And the clips are properly mated on the transfer unit. So once we verify that all the lock wire and the pins and the brackets are properly installed, then that's pretty much pre-fire checks done.
When CIWS verifies an incoming missile threat, it tracks the threat till it's in ideal range and opens fire. It keeps firing until the target is neutralized.
It's a fully autonomous weapon system, completely self-reliant, and absolutely lethal. It will shoot until there are no rounds left. Even if the ship is sinking, this gun will defend the ship.
USS Howard is packed with impressive hardware and software. But just like on USS Laffy, drills and training are essential to ensure everyone on board knows what to do in combat.
Efficient teamwork is the cornerstone of what we do, what we train to, how we operate, and without the sailors working together with the other sailors that's working together with the gear that we maintain, we can't be both efficient nor effective.
Today, the Arleigh Burke destroyers help fulfill the roles that once were carried out by cruisers like HMS Gannet.
The Royal Navy of the 19th century effectively was the world's imperial policeman, the super naval power that effectively kept the law of the sea. That role, post-Second World War in particular, has transferred to the American Navy. They're currently the naval policemen of the 21st century.
With advanced weaponry and modern technology, the need for the bigger cruisers with large guns is all but gone. But destroyers have retained their role as versatile combat ships, feared hunters, and fierce defenders of their fleet.